said last week, I think week 4, we had talked about the conquistadors and how the Europeans started to conquer the New World and begin to colonize it. Of course, today I'm going to move on to talk about how in Europe at the same time you got this monarchs that kind of start to create their own centralized power, and you start to see the early development of these modernized states that'll exist later. Like you've heard of France and other countries, of course, that you've heard of today that exist now. A lot of it kind of comes to fruition during this time period, of course, we're going to talk about today. I'm going to, of course, first talk about, of course, we'll get into more into the Bourbon Dynasty a little later. Of course, I'm first going to talk about today kind of a little background, of course, about, the Age of Absolutism, which really starts, really probably going back to the early modern times, going back to, I guess, 1600s, more or less. But they believe that the Age of Absolutism was a period in Europe where you had these monarchs that were kind of like autocrats that ruled over their states. They didn't have like these, we have constitutions that we have today, like most countries now, like especially in the West, in general, Western Europe, or in the Western Hemisphere, or even legislative type, bodies. Whether we got the U.S. Congress or England's got Parliament or whatever. A lot of countries did not have that at that time, even up to like the 1700s. Pretty much it's what the king said. The king was, the law of the land in general. And so a lot of these countries in Europe were kind of like that at that time. I'll kind of go through a list of them, but these are the kind of countries that were pretty much, considered almost like absolute type states that existed at the time. France, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, even, and of course, Spain also. I think even Portugal, if you can kind of throw a bunch of other countries probably in that list also as well. They were kind of somewhat absolute, where a lot of the kings and its ministers had a lot of power over the state, and there's really no representative bodies that really control everything like they do. Looks like Spence also is joining us this morning as well. Let me go ahead and get into and talk about, first of all, like what were some of the influences that were in absolutism. We had all these monarchs that had, so much power within the state. I'll kind of talk about some things that, of course, I'll get to first today. I'll get to that in a second about that particular slide. But let me talk about Thomas Hobbes. He's kind of considered one of the early influences that really, they think, kind of led to absolute governments throughout Europe overall. And he wrote a book called Leviathan, which came out, I think, around the year 1650s, 1657 or 1658. It's about when it came out. I think that's actually a typo, and it should be 1651. That's what it should be, actually. And Hobbes had this idea that the state should be run by a centralized monarch. The reason why was because he felt like the average people, like the common people in general, weren't able to really run a state, like government or whatever. A lot of them lacked education and things like that. And so he believed that, the monarch should be in power to decide things because he's more educated. And of course, I think he also thinks that humans are selfish and violent. They have their own self-interest and things like that. And so things would get out of control, without a monarch that's, in power like that. The only thing was he's the one that kind of comes up with this idea that there's some kind of social contract that exists between the people of a state and a king. And that basically the people give the king these centralized powers. And then in return, the king is supposed to give the people, certain kinds of rights overall. However, what happened over time, a lot of European states, more or less, the kings became despotic. That's what happened. And that's not exactly what I think Hobbes had in mind. He definitely favored a centralized type government overall, because I think Leviathan was written like around the time of when the English Civil War was, going on in England. And so So that's basically the premise on that. And of course, he kind of compares it to the Leviathan in the Bible, like so-called sea monsters and things like that. And that's his idea of like an actual monarch. So that's kind of one influence that kind of was there overall. Samantha's also joining us this morning, also as well. I don't have a slide on that one, but there's another writer I guess they always talk about. I'll mention too. I forgot about the Prince. The Prince, written by Machiavelli, a Machiavellian politics. Going back to the 16th century. That was a very famous political treatise as well. In fact, it's one of the first modern ones, I think, like at the end of during the Renaissance, that really influenced a lot of monarchs as well, like on how to rule as a monarch, how to maintain their power, etc. Machiavelli describes how monarchs sometimes have to do things that are not exactly unsavory. Basically something that they should do. They have to be like a lion and like a fox, to kind of stay in power. Be very clever, more or less. Sometimes be very brutal, to the people, just to maintain power or whatever. And so a lot of monarchs in Europe, were influenced by it. Like, of course, Emperor Charles V, who was also the King of Spain, was definitely influenced by it. And Henry VIII in England was influenced by that particular book as well. And so a lot of various, monarchs in Europe were kind of influenced by books like that overall. Of course, there's another thing, of course, we'll get to later, which was, of course, major influence, has a lot to do with like religion. There's a lot of connection between absolutism and the Catholic faith in Europe, especially with the idea of divine right of kings, which I'll get to in a second about that. But the Bible's definitely one of the big influences that they think led to the ideas of absolutism, later called divine right of kings, political theory. And it's this idea that the monarch is the highest mortal that's on earth. And so he should be in power to do, the things he should do as a ruler. And everybody else is kind of below him as a whole. A lot of this theory came from like a medieval idea that'd been kind of around for a long time, which is you may have heard about the Great Chain of Being, which is this medieval theory that basically there was a hierarchy from heaven to earth, where basically you had God in heaven with his angels, etc. You can see like the stars and the moon, of course, obviously there. And then below that, you can see the king as the highest mortal on earth, followed by the church, all the nobility that are below him. And then you've got also the common man. Then after that, you've got all the animals and the plants, all the rocks and other things like minerals or whatever, I guess things that are inanimate objects or whatever. And so that's the order of things in the universe, at least going back to medieval times in general. And so that's the belief of why, kings rule, because God put them, in that place to rule. So this is something that's kind of around a long time, up to like the Age of Enlightenment, before they kind of destroy that idea. But a lot of people believe this, more or less, about that. There's another thing. I kind of show this sometimes, but like in France, they had this thing called the Hand of Justice, which you may have heard about, which supposedly symbolized the king's absolute power in general. I think the actual scepter, which you see on the left there, went back to, I want to say, Louis XIV, who was one of the kings of France. And supposedly a king could do three things as a ruler. He could basically caress you, he could bless you, or he could strike you. This kind of shows the power of these monarchs. And so if he wants to throw you in prison for no reason or whatever, he could do that. Like, the whole, that movie or novel, The Man in the Iron Mask or whatever it is, that kind of idea. So the king could easily do that. So I think up to Napoleon, you can see they were kind of using that in France as what a monarch could do power-wise overall. So they're kind of above the law. They are the law, more or less these monarchs that are in power, France and other countries, of course, that are there. Also, I think they talked about, if I could find it, there he is right there, Jacques Bousset. I think they were talking about him. He's also very famous as well. He was kind of instrumental in being a major proponent of divine right in France. And he heavily influenced a lot of these early monarchs in France, like Louis XIII, Louis XIV of the Bourbon Dynasty, et cetera. And he kind of had this same argument that the king was the God's representative on earth and was entitled to basically unquestioned obedience to everybody. And I think Bousset compared it to like the kings of the Bible, like especially in the Old Testament, like King David or a King Solomon. So that's their idea of the type of stereotype of powerful rulers that they want to rule, of course, in Europe. So anyway, kind of just talking about kind of the background of absolutism, especially the French one, of course, that we'll talk about first today. That's well known. So I'm going to talk about that, get into and discuss, of course, what we call, French absolutism. That's there. You have the Bourbon Dynasty, which comes to power in 1589. They're in power up to like the early 19th century, close to about 2 centuries that the Bourbons reign at one point. Of course, they don't call it Bourbon. I think the French name is actually Bourbon. That's how they actually say it. Of course, I think our version of Bourbon is more like from Bourbon County, which is up in Kentucky. So I've actually been to a few times where they make, whiskey and all that, bourbon whiskey and all that. And of course, we think of Bourbon Street, right? Like in New Orleans, Louisiana. But it's actually named after the dynasty, not the drink. You wonder about that. Of course, they weren't in power that whole time you're looking at right there. Of course, the Bourbons were out of power for a while. You can see close to 20 years, 1793 to 1814, because of the French Revolution and then the age of Napoleon, where Napoleon Bonaparte ruled over France. But actually, it's kind of funny, but the Bourbons didn't recognize that period. So they claim that one of their rulers, I think Louis XVII and Louis XVIII, reigned instead and all that. We'll talk about all the different monarchs, of course, that are very famous that they have. I'll kind of go into some of the early ones that were well known. Of course, you see there in that picture, Henry IV, known usually as Henry of Navarre, was, of course, the founder of the Bourbon Dynasty. He was actually a cousin of the Medicis and the Valois dynasty. And he came to power in 1589. This is kind of at the end of the French wars of religion that were kind of going on in the country. And if you know about Navarre, Navarre was, if you remember correctly, we kind of talked about him before. He was a Huguenot. He was a French Calvinist that eventually converted to Catholicism to become king of France. Because the Valois dynasty ran out of heirs. They didn't have any sons that could take over the throne. And so he took power after that. And the name Bourbon, by the way, comes from a distant relative, his name Louis I, who was called the Duke of Bourbon, that lived in the 1300s or 14th century. So that's where the actual name of the dynasty originated from. So the Bourbon dynasty is actually like a cadet branch. The Capetian dynasty, which the Capetians was the original dynasty that went all the way back to the Middle Ages. I think the first king was named Hugh Capet, and hence the name being used. So they're all Capetians, but it's just a cadet branch that kind of breaks away from it, that's related to them, like cousins of them, of that particular dynasty that rules. So Navarre himself would reign in power. He reigns from 1589 up to about 1610. And I think we've kind of talked about him a little bit before, Henry IV, but Henry IV was a former Huguenot I told you about. And he was the one that was behind the Edict of Nantes, if you remember correctly, which he signed in 1598. If you remember about that, that was an edict by the Bourbons that basically gave the Huguenots, which are French Protestants that were in the country, basically religious rights, like to practice a religion throughout the country. They could have their own churches. They could have their own schools. And so that was very instrumental in helping to end the French wars of religion. So he's kind of important, Henry IV, because he kind of created peace in the country. He united the whole nation of France around one country and all that. And so because of it, Henry IV was later given nicknames. They called him Henry the Great, but a lot of times people called him Good King Henry. Was one of his nicknames he was called. Now, I'll talk about it later. There's a famous national anthem, which, of course, is named for him, which it's got all kinds of names. I think people call it Viva le Roi, Henry IV, I think is one name they called it, or the March, Henry IV, I think is another name they also called as well. That became France's actual national anthem up to like at least the French Revolution it was for a while. Before we go today, I'll play it for you, kind of what it sounds like and all that. And all these different countries, were creating their own national anthems and things like that, which a lot of them still have some of them still have some of these anthems that are still around, of course, today, which I'll kind of show you later. So that's Henry IV, who he was and why he was, of course, important as one of the first rulers of the Bourbons. Now, he had a son who would reign also next, which is Louis XIII. What happened was Louis XIII, his son, became the king because there was this Catholic fanatic who evidently, I guess, didn't like the whole Edict of Nantes, named Francois Rabelais, I think was his name, stabbed Henry IV in 1610, stabbed him to death. And so Louis XIII became king. He was only about 9 when he came to the throne, so very, very young at the time. And apparently, for like the first few years of his reign, I know his regency was controlled by his mother, whose name was Marie de Medici, who was, by the way, a cousin of the Medicis. I think she was related to Catherine de Medici. I want to say like a niece. Marie de Medici was the second wife of King Henry IV, who came in, and she's the one that introduced him to eventually the man that would end up really running the country under Louis XIII. Some say he had the real power behind the throne, which was the Cardinal Richelieu. You've probably heard about. He's really considered very famous because he's the one that kind of comes in and begins to really centralize the throne in the monarchy with the French government. And he's considered the first chief minister of France, although I don't think it was really ever an official title that it was actually called in France. But I think they consider Richelieu to be one of the first prime ministers that you have in history. I know you have the English or British that kind of developed the prime minister position later, like Sir Robert Walpole was one of the first in Britain they had over Parliament. But he actually is considered one of the first to really be what we call a prime minister now. And his real name was Armand Jean Duplessis. They call him the Duke of Richelieu. And he was actually a member of the Catholic Church. He was actually called the Red Eminence because of his red dress of a cardinal. Cardinals were famous clerical officials within the Catholic Church that are, I guess, above the bishops. And he had a major influence on the rise of absolutism in France. He helps to strengthen the king's power, of course, at that time. And so his policies helped to really outline what a lot of future kings like Louis XIV will be later. In fact, some people think he was the first absolutist ruler over France, but he was not really a monarch, but he had his own palace, though, which was pretty much how powerful he was in the country. How do they do this, the Bourbons? Well, they believe how they created more power for the monarch was that a lot of these monarchs, like the Bourbons, they began to weaken the nobility. Before this, you know about it, a lot of noblemen would often have like their own armies, like their own castles and things like that within the actual country. And so they took that away from them. And so only the monarch could control the armies, control fortresses, castles, or whatever. And so that gave the monarchs a lot of power. Also, they exempted a lot of the nobility from taxes. They paid probably some taxes, but the amount of taxation they paid was like limited compared to the lower classes, which paid way more. Like middle class, lower classes pretty much paid more taxes under him. And so that's how they're able to get more power, more or less. Also, the middle class, especially the upper middle class, kind of becomes powerful too under the monarchs. They use a lot of them as also ministers as well, because if you have enough money, you can actually buy like a nobility title. Because in France, they had two different types of titles that you could get. You have the so-called nobility of the sword, which that was like nobility that went back to like the medieval times, where it was like hereditary. And then nobility of the robe was where you could literally buy your noble title. I guess pay so much to the crown or whatever, they would give it to you. And so I don't know if you ever seen that movie called The Count of Monte Cristo. It's a kind of a famous movie or whatever, where he practically buys, his noble title, whatever. So you could actually do that in France, at the time. So Richelieu was also important in fighting against their enemies, like the Habsburg Empire, which they were fighting, in the 30 Years' War at the time. And, Richelieu wanted to weaken the Habsburg Empire and begin supporting a lot of the Protestant states, not because of religious reasons or anything like that, but a lot of it had to do with the fact that they were trying to also develop trade with a lot of these countries in Europe, like the Dutch Republic, Kingdom of England, etc. So they had this idea that they could trade with these countries, even if they were different religions or whatever, they could still do that. And so France was heavily involved in the development of the Peace of Westphalia. Of course, the various treaties that would help in the war. And so because of that, France became a world power, following the 30 Years' War, which we've talked about before. Richelieu was also instrumental in developing what they call the, you may have heard of the Académie Française or French Academy. It's this French council that controls a lot of the use of the French language, no matter what it's being used for, whether it's being used to write poetry, novels, plays, in culture, literature, science, whatever it's being used in, basically. And the council members, I think, are called immortals that are basically on it. And so he was very instrumental in really trying to facilitate what French culture is, French art, and things like that. And you see him a lot. He's a character, by the way. I don't know if you ever heard of, you may have seen movies like The Three Musketeers, or maybe read the novel Three Musketeers. Alexander Dumas, of course, wrote a lot about him, and all that. And so he's this kind of character that's kind of around, that's real famous at that time in the 17th century. So that's Cardinal Richelieu, of course, a very well-known figure. So now I'm going to, of course, move on. We're of course, kind of talking about, basically the early Bourbon period. You got Louis the 13th, the second one, and of course, his father, Henry the Fourth, we've talked about already. I'm going to also move on next. We're going to, of course, talk about also another great king, of course, which follows Louis the 13th on his heels, of course, which is Louis the 14th. Now, Louis the 14th, you see here, known as the Sun King, of course, considered the third Bourbon king, is really considered to be the greatest of the absolute monarchs of the Age of Absolutism. He reigns pretty much in the late 17th, early 18th century. Louis is, of course, considered to be the longest reigning European monarch in history at a little over 72 years, which has never been broken yet. I think maybe Queen Elizabeth II might break it. I think she's on 68 years right now, so another 4 years or so she might break it, more or less. But he was often called by different nicknames. Of course, Sun King is the common name that we know of. Like in Louisiana, he's kind of a famous monarch because, as you know, Louisiana is, of course, named after him. But he was called that because, the sun was seen as a symbol of his court at Versailles. A lot of people called him the Louis the Great throughout Europe, or also simply just called the Grand Monarch, or Great Monarch is also another nickname that he was known by. Why was he seen as this great absolute monarch? A lot of it had to do with the fact that a lot of his craft of state, how he ran his state, how he kind of micromanaged it personally himself, with not as many powerful ministers like before. That's partially why he's kind of considered to be one of the greatest of the absolute monarchs. Like definitely one of the best examples, because he kind of ruled without a chief minister. He had some ministers I'll get to later that were kind of famous that were under him, especially I think Colbert, I think was one of the most famous overall. But most majority of his reign, he reigned pretty much with his own policies, micromanaged by himself overall. That motto they talked about in the little video, of course, I am the state, or l'état c'est moi, pretty much sums up his policies as an absolutist, which actually it means the state, it's me basically running it. Is what he's trying to say. I'm the one running the state. I'm the reason why France is a great country. So he's the reason for why France is basically a major power. So his policies and all that, or what's in control. I'm the law of the land, etc. Of course, early on he was not. If you really read about the early stages of his monarchy, of course we'll get. I talked about Jacques Bousset had kind of an influence on Louis XIII and Louis XIV, but early on in his reign, France was actually ruled by Jules Mazarin, who was this cardinal that had been handpicked by Richelieu to take over the country. So he was one that was the chief minister who was in power for about almost 20 years. I think 1643 to 1661, when Louis was just too young to reign, because Louis came to the throne when he was 5 years old. So it was kind of hard for him to really do anything in power. Mazarin also maintained a very close relationship with Louis's mother. They of course talked about, which is Queen Anne. This would be Queen Anne of Austria, of course, her name. It should be Queen Anne, excuse me. But there's been speculation about that whole relationship with Queen Anne and, of course, Mazarin. I think there's speculation that Mazarin had some kind of love affair with Louis XIV's mother. Of course, the wife of Louis XIII and all that. And so I think there was a joke going around with some of the nobility that Mazarin was called the custodian of the Queen's bed. That's what he was called. Also, some of the nobility thought he was trying to steal power from Louis and the monarch, and so they called him the so-called Italian thief because of the fact that he was also a cardinal in the Catholic Church as well. So there was a lot of mistrust of Cardinal Mazarin when he was in power, and it got so bad, like they talked about in the video, that there was this rebellion that broke out among the nobility called the Fronde. It was well known. It was kind of like a civil war in the country where it pitted supporters of Mazarin with the king versus basically the nobility. And for a few years, it looked like, might. I think they even tried to actually exile Mazarin. He was so powerful in the country, but in the end, Mazarin's policies and the crown basically won out. And so by the 1650s, after that, the nobility lost a lot of power, in the country. By the way, young Louis would go on to marry. He actually would marry this princess who was from Spain. I'll give you her name, but her name was Maria Teresa of Spain, who was actually his cousin. And it was this political marriage that was made between the French and the Spanish to kind of end a series of wars that went back to the 30 Years' War, which the French and the Spanish sometimes call it the so-called Franco-Spanish War or Franco-Spanish conflicts, which have been going on for several decades, more or less. But it helped to kind of end the conflict. But I think there was a later deal where Louis XIV was kind of mad he didn't get a really good dowry, and he wanted part of the Netherlands. And so later on, it actually sparked some wars in the Netherlands, which kind of caused a lot of conflict between, like, the Holy Roman Empire, I know, and the rest of other countries in Europe. But we'll talk about that later, about how that kind of course, occurs. Louis was known for a lot of mistresses. That's something he's kind of famous for, which he had. A lot of these monarchs would have mistresses on the side, with even illegitimate children, that they would sometimes have as well. Francois d'Albine, known as the Marquis de Maintenon, that was, of course, one of his most famous mistresses, of course, who he later, by the way, they think secretly married, like a second wife that he had after his first wife died. And she was very important, Marquis de Maintenon. She was really considered like a close advisor to Louis XIV. And a lot of these royal mistresses, especially the head mistresses, were very powerful. They had a lot of power behind the throne, and were often seen as advisors, of course, to these kings. Now, of course, the thing that Louis XIV is very famous for, I think everybody's heard about this more or less, is the fact that he's famous for a palace, of course, that he would build in France, of course, which is well known, of course, today, which is the Palace of Versailles, or the Chateau de Versailles, if you want the French name, more or less. And this was, of course, a very famous palace, of course, that he began constructing after he gained sole power in the country. Most of it was constructed between the 1660s to about the 1680s. He was about 23, by the way, when Mazarin died. And from there, he didn't really take a chief minister. So after that, he was able to kind of do whatever he wanted to do, more or less, as ruler. And so he began to construct this lavish palace, which, by the way, influenced a lot of other people later. A lot of monarchs who kind of build kind of comparable type palaces throughout Europe overall. It did become like the central court of the Bourbon monarchs, especially the three monarchs there you got listed: Louis XIV, Louis XV, and that should be, I don't know why I did that. Louis XVI is the other one, of course, as well, that reigned up to the French Revolution. They reigned over 100 years, more or less, at that time. And eventually they'll abandon it. Of course, I'll get to it later. But Louis XIV, 15, and 16 there. And Versailles was constructed as Baroque style architecture type palace that was influenced by the Italians, like Italian type construction throughout Europe, which was kind of becoming real popular in the rest of Europe of the 1600s overall. And so it was a type of highly decorative style that was very theatrical, of course, very showy. They even had other versions like Rococo that was kind of real popular into like the 18th century, which was like kind of a late Baroque style as well. And I think I've got different images, of course, showing Versailles, which has a lot of parks, and gardens and water fountains that, of course, are part of it as well. They started building on it in the 1660s. They do think that Versailles was originally built not as a palace, but as a hunting lodge by Louis XIII, which was, the father of Louis XIV. But starting under Louis XIV, they began to expand it into a massive palace, which took kind of multiple extensions where they kind of built onto it over time. Those are some of the main men that were kind of involved in the construction of Versailles, which, by the way, took about, I want to say, close to about 40,000 workers to work on it. The construction of it for around 20 years. And Louis Laveau is considered one of the ones that's important. He's like one of the main architects that designed the majority of Versailles, minus the Hall of Mirrors. So he's kind of important. Also, André Le Notre was another famous architect. He was a landscape architect that was involved. He was the one that kind of built a lot of the famous gardens and parks. There were kind of their orchards and things like that that were added on to, the area, like the land that's around actually the palace, which is hundreds of acres that are included as well. And also Charles Le Brun, who I think Louis XIV thought was one of the greatest artists in France at the time, was the one that painted a lot of the ceilings of Versailles. That's well known. And Jules Mansart, of course, also another famous architect, was the one who designed and built the Hall of Mirrors as well. So you have all these different Frenchmen that, Louis was a patron to overall and paid to build a lot of these buildings that are there. Of course, they're a part of the whole Palace of Versailles. Here's kind of an interior map, by the way, of the palace itself. So it had this court that you kind of enter into right here, where they had a statue of Louis XIV that was right here. It did have two wings to it, one on the left and one on the right that you had. And most famous parts of it, if you know about it, are the King's Chamber or King's Suite, which is right here, like the apartments that are there. And then you got the Queen's private suite, which is over here. Of course, the Hall of Mirrors are back here, where the gardens all are behind it. There's, of course, Assembly Hall over here. They have a royal chapel over here, where Louis would have his daily masses there. They even had a royal opera where composers would come, put on plays like Moliere or whatever at the time. And so that basically became almost like a capital, you can say, of basically France at the time. And of course, the famous courtyard of the Palace of Versailles with the statue, by the way, of Louis XIV in the center right there. Versailles, of course, is more known for, I'll kind of show you in a second here, but the thing that's the most famous thing it's, of course, well known for is, Jules Mansart, of course, developed the Hall of Mirrors, which he built in the 1670s, like one of the later additions added to it. Of course, the famous Hall of Mirrors is the largest room, of course, in the Hall of Mirrors. It's like kind of like this grand gallery that they built into the backside of Versailles, which is famous for all of its glass-clad mirrors that are there. It's like 17 mirrors that go along the wall in the actual Baroque-style gallery you're looking at. And each mirror has 350 pieces of glass on it. So it's not one big glass pane, but multiple. And the gallery was very famous, by the way, for being used for different things. Louis would meet, dignitaries from foreign countries there to kind of, I guess, awe them or whatever about the state. They had lavish balls they were held there. I believe weddings were held there, I believe. And I think there was even a case where some nobility would come there to give birth, to have children, I swear, there. It's also where they signed peace treaties. I think the most famous peace treaty that was signed there, if you know about it, was the Treaty of Versailles, signed there in 1919, that ended World War I, as you know. So Hall of Mirrors is considered like one of the most famous rooms that's in it. I believe it has, I forget how many rooms that it has now. I know originally it had like 700 rooms in it, but now it's like, I believe it's 2,300 after they kind of expanded it over time. So it does have a lot of rooms in it as well. And when Louis XIV would have the government in session, all the ministers would come there, everybody, and they would actually stay in the actual palace with all their servants and all that, which is kind of crowded, when that happened. So that's something that Louis did. And I think Louis did this also to kind of, micromanage. He was able to micromanage the state by having everybody there, at the palace in general. And so that was his form of kind of trying to, rule the craft of state and all that. That was I think one of the original entrances into the actual palace itself. There used to be a gate that was right here that ran from this corner over to here. But it was stormed during the French Revolution when they broke into the palace, which I'll kind of talk about later in the French Revolution. Also, I think I've got pictures showing some of the parks and gardens that they got. It's got orchards, gardens, lots of flowers, of course, planted, of course, throughout the parks of Versailles in general. And Louis XIV's favorite type of flower, of course, was the so-called tulip plant. They planted a lot of those, which 17th century tulips were really, really popular. There was a so-called tulip mania going on, of course, at the time. Looks like Alex is also joining us as well. We're having a great morning overall. Also, I want to show you as well, give you an idea of some of the stats, of course, about Versailles itself. You can see here. You can see that it took up a lot of space. So 2,000 acres of grounds took up Versailles, 12 miles of roads, 27 miles of trellises, 200,000 trees were planted. That's a lot. 210,000 flowers planted every year. 80 miles of rows of trees, 55 acres of surface area of the Grand Canal that runs to it as well. 12 miles of enclosing walls, 50 fountains, 620 fountain nozzles, 21 miles of water conduits. Look about the water they have to use to feed to also those fountains as well. 3,600 cubic meters per hour as well. The actual palace has 51,210 square meters of floors to it, 26 acres of roof, you can see, 2,153 windows, 700 rooms originally. I think now it's got 2,300 now. That was originally what it had, 700 rooms. See all the staircases. It's got a lot of artwork too. Like I forget how much artwork it's got in it, but I think like 30,000 works of art are also inside of it as well, because Louis XIV was a big patron of the arts, of course, during that time. Different artists like Moliere, playwright and things like that. Of course, Racine, you may have heard of Racine, who was also very famous at the time. So I'll kind of talk about also, how did they get all this wealth, in general? What's the deal with that? Well, under Louis XIV, if you know, their empire started to be really massive, especially under Jean-Baptiste Colbert. I'll kind of get to him today. He's a very important minister that was really under Louis XIV. In fact, they consider him to be one of his chief ministers. He didn't really have an official minister, but if you want to talk about one man that pretty much was seen as his chief minister, it was definitely Colbert for sure. His real title was actually Controller General of Finances. That's what we'll call him actually. So not chief minister. But he was actually famous in expanding the French Empire, using a lot of mercantilism type policies that were heavily influenced by like the Spanish and the Portuguese. That were kind of doing the same thing at the time. And a lot of his mercantile policies were often called Colbertism. Some people think he influenced the rise of mercantilism as a whole. I'll give you a definition of it, but mercantilism is a type of economic trade system that was real popular between the 1500s up to the 1700s. So 16th to the 18th centuries, more or less. And how it worked basically was that nations would accumulate as much gold as possible through trying to export more than import, like goods. And so they would use like mostly colonies throughout the world to create natural resources where they bring those back to France, create products, and then sell it throughout their empire, like export it all over the place to make money. Predominantly, they trade within their empire, usually, most of the time. They might trade with other countries, but there's usually import tax involved with that if you did do that. So that's something that he was kind of instrumental in doing as a whole. Under Colbert and, of course, France, their main colonies were really three areas. They had New France, of course, the most famous, which, French Canada, which ran, by the way, eventually from Canada all the way down to the Mississippi River Valley, like where Louisiana is, of course, today. They add that later to it. Also in New France and Canada, they had two main forms of things that they made the most money off of. Fur trade was the main thing that they made most money off, of course. They traded a lot with the Native Americans there, indigenous peoples, like the Huron and the Ottawa, etc. Fisheries were important too, like off the eastern coast of Canada, catching like cod and other fish, which, of course, the French could eat as well, especially during Lent and all that, when they couldn't eat meat. India, they have things like coffee, pepper, spices, cotton, Colbert was instrumental in creating a company that actually controlled trade in India that was called the French East India Company, which was kind of like a rival to what the English and Dutch had, because the English and Dutch had similar companies. English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, they were also there as well. And then in Saint Domingue, which now called Haiti, I guess the eastern side of, well, like I think the western side of Hispaniola, they had like a lot of sugar plantations where they, raised that for sugar and making rum. So those are all very important as part of, the French Empire under him. I'll kind of show you a picture of their empire at the time, but their empire you can see here, at least in the Europe, and you can see in America, you can see all the areas that they control. So France, mostly you can see where France is today, which is right here. And you can see Canada itself, New France will control all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico in that blue area that we're looking at least up to the 18th century. They control, of course, that area. Another thing about Colbert was instrumental in creating a glass industry, which was important, in building a lot of these palaces like Versailles, etc. Because before, glass was imported from Italy quite often, like Venice or whatever. And so he created his own company to do that, which was called Saint Gobain is the modern name, which is, by the way, the company is still around today. It's still today an actual company. Also, he helped found, they think, the French Navy, and he was also instrumental behind developing the French merchant marine, like for economic reasons as well. And Colbert also was well known for sending a lot of explorers to the New World, like La Salle, etc., to kind of explore the Mississippi River Basin, things like that. All that was kind of occurring under Louis XIV's reign at the time. Colbert was also instrumental in expanding the transportation networks throughout France. They started building better roads, building canals in France. Those are things that they started doing in the 17th century. Also, he raised tariffs in the country to protect a lot of French industries in the country as well. And so a lot of their trade is mostly concentrated between France and their empire. And then they just, tax imports or whatever from other countries and things like that. They do think Colbert is kind of maybe one of the first that developed the Code Noir or Black Code, which was a type of slave code that the French were kind of notorious for having, which regulated slavery throughout the French Empire, especially like in Louisiana here today, kind of, definitely regulated for sure. And they think he kind of created the first version of it, although others like later wrote it as well. But they think he kind of influenced it, they think, as well. So those are kind of some of the things that Colbert, was well known for. And Colbert, like I said, was pretty much, he had a lot of power for a bunch of years, up to like, I want to say the 1680s. But after he died, they think that France's state kind of began to decline afterwards. And so they do think he was the brain behind a lot of why the French economy was booming at that time under Louis XIV. Now, there is one thing that Louis gets in trouble with later, more to the end of his reign, was that he decided to revoke the Edict of Nantes. It's kind of a controversial thing that happened under Louis XIV, which occurred in October of 1685 through his so-called Edict of Fontainebleau, which is named after one of the palaces of the Bourbons. And so what it did was it revoked the Edict of Nantes. And what it did was it basically revoked rights. It revoked religious rights of the Huguenots in the country. They were either told you either had to convert to the Catholic faith or get the hell out, leave the country, basically. And so a lot of them, by the thousands, were forced to leave. I guess some of them did convert, to the Catholic faith, more or less. But from there, basically, they think at least 100,000 or more may have left the country. And Louis closed down all their churches. He closed down whether they had any schools or whatever, closed that down also as well. And so a lot of them fled to, other countries. Some went to the Netherlands, as an example. Some went to the German states. Some went to America, believe it or not. They think that may have had an influence later on the Americans later, went there as well. But you have people that go there as well, like in the 17th century. And so it is kind of a controversial thing. I think some historians seem to think that the revocation, the revoking, this particular edict, Edict of Nantes, they think harmed the French economy. They would kind of create this brain drain where, especially the middle class, a lot of the artisans and maybe workers that were kind of important to France's economy, a lot of them left. And so they kind of think that was one of the causes of why maybe the French Empire began to decline between the 17th and the 18th centuries as well. And so it kind of starts that road down to, the French Revolution that'll later be, in the later part of the 18th century that we'll have. And of course, the other thing that Louis, they think another cause of it for sure was definitely all the wars that Louis got in as well. He kind of regretted it, if you know about this, about all the wars that he fought into, which is like numerous, like 3 or 4, I forget how many wars they were involved in. It was a lot, at least 3 or 4 wars they were involved in. And but Louis, in the later part of his reign, got obsessed with trying to take over the Netherlands. I think it went back to the so-called War of Devolution that broke out, I want to say back in the 1680s. And so he basically wanted to take control of that. Also part of Western Germany, where the Holy Roman Empire was, which really basically made one of his cousins mad, which is Emperor Leopold I, who was one of the major rulers of the time in Europe. Besides him, who was a rival in the Holy Roman Empire in Austria. And so those two end up becoming embroiled in a major, really 2 wars. They have that break out. The War of the Grand Alliance, which I'll talk about later. And they also had the War of the Spanish Succession, which also breaks out because Louis tries to put one of his grandsons on the throne of Spain, which he's successful with, but it unites this huge war in Europe at the time. And so by the time he does die, which is in 1715, his great-grandson takes over because he outlives most of his sons and grandsons, Louis XIV. And so he becomes king in 1715. Louis XV, who the French later called Louis the Beloved. And we'll get more into it later, but under Louis XV's reign, the French state continues to decline more or less. There was a joke later, I think, that Louis XV remarked or something about where he said, "After me comes the flood." He said, thinking that after this, pretty much that's going to be the end. He was kind of right about that, of course, later. So I'll talk a little about him later, and then he's got a grandson later, of course, named Louis XVI, that also reigns. He gets overthrown in the French Revolution, and then after that, you don't really have too many other rulers after that are really Bourbons. They do have Louis XVII, who was basically the son of Louis XVI, who never really reigned. He died in prison during the French Revolution, but the Bourbons kind of count him as a monarch for some reason. And then you got Louis XVIII, who was brother of Louis XVI, who reigned later after Napoleon was kicked off the throne, of course, as France's emperor. Now they do have Charles X, who was another brother of also Louis XVI and Louis XVIII, and he's the last Bourbon king that you have that rules over. So they don't have any female rulers; they're all pretty much male rulers that, of course, that reign over France. So we'll talk more about. Of course, later I'm going to be getting into. We'll kind of be moving on later in the week on Wednesday, I'll get into talk about the rise of the Habsburgs in Europe. You got the Spanish Habsburg Empire, and you got the Habsburg monarchy or Habsburg Empire that's based around Austria and the Holy Roman Empire. I'll get to that later as well and talk about that. Before I go, I will kind of share with you what was the actual national anthem, of course, of the Kingdom of France. I'm going to kind of show that to you, of course, before I go, what that was. Of course, later it got replaced by the Marseillaise, which became popular, of course, because of the French Revolution, all that. But I'll share with you the March Henry IV, of course, before I go. Now, just a few reminders before I go today. I don't think there's any questions. It looks like for me that was in the live stream, but don't forget you have, of course, a new assignment I'm going to, of course, post today, which is on the Conquest of America lecture. So make sure you start working on that, which will be due next week, of course. But this week we do have the World Exploration Quiz that is due, of course, in Canvas. So don't forget about completing that overall. I do have, I think, don't forget, if you haven't turned your vocab in, get that to me. Either, I guess you can still post it still, but either that or you can email it to me if you haven't finished it, so I can add in points for that. Because I think for now, I'm probably going to start taking points off. You, of course, turn it late right now. So I think that's it for now today. But like I said, later in the week, I will, of course, be lecturing, like a part 2 lecture, of course. We'll talk about the rise of the Habsburgs, of course, in Europe. So that's it for today. I'll, of course, share you this national anthem, of course, of France from their actual kingdom.
Vive Henri IV, vive ce roi vaillant. Vive Henri IV, vive ce roi vaillant. Ce diable à 4 a le triple talent de voir et se battre et d'être vert galant. J'aimons les filles et j'aimons le bon vin. J'aimons les filles et j'aimons le bon vin. De l'eau baudrille, voilà le gai refrain. J'aimons les filles et j'aimons le bon vin. Au diable guerre, rancunes et partis. Au diable guerre, rancunes et partis. Comme nos pères, chantons en vrais amis. Au choc des vers, les roses et les lys. Vive la France, vive le roi Henri. Vive la France, vive le roi Henri. Car un son danse en disant comme Paris. Vive la France, vive le roi Henri. Vive le roi